Now back in Photoshop, let's split these out into separate render layers that we will be able to work on individually. So let's disable everything for now. And so let's start off with the basics. At the bottom I want just a basic projection, but there's no reason for me to split out this environment base layer with this, so I think I'll project these together. I'll include the gold also and the water, and I have some color correction and ambient occlusion as well. I'll just roll into the same render. What this will allow us to do is save a lot of time, because there's nothing really that I want to edit too much in this layer, so I think we will be able to just project this as it is right now. And the good thing is that with matte painting we don't have to render an entire sequence of a lighting pass. We can render one frame at the start and one frame at the end, and then just reproject those as a matte painting and still get 99% of the same information. So let's take this, what we have here, and save this out of Photoshop by going to File, Save As. And I've already done that, so I'll skip it, but feel free to do this. Next up, we'll go to our distant light, and here I've made some adjustments to it previously, but let's just set this from color dodge back to normal. And so this is our distant light, and again, this I will project in Clarice as well, instead of rendering an entire sequence of this light, because that will be very time costly and I guess inefficient. And instead, by projecting this as a matte painting, we still get the same information and we'll still stick to the geo, but we will be able to save a lot of time on rendering. Another reason that I want to split this out from the previous layers is that I think we have some nice opportunity to maybe animate this light a little bit using tools in Nuke, and we'll just fake a little bit of movement in maybe the clouds to have more of the light being revealed here, or a little bit more obscured here, and that will just add a little bit of tiny subtle movement to our shot, and it's something very quick and simple to do, but it'll be a nice effect. So let's save this out separately as well. Then after this, I want to have a look at my PhotoRef elements, and let's just change this back to color dodge. So here I have all of my photo reference elements, and what I can do with these is first I'll split them out. So let me just delete these. What I will do is take all of these shanties that I've painted in, all of these little building details and elements, and I'm going to create a black layer underneath, and I'll just select my shanties group and I'll click Ctrl+J to duplicate it and Ctrl+E to just merge it into one layer, and I'll just disable the original group. And now I will go into my channels and select my alpha and select all and delete everything, so my alpha is just black, and then select my layer with all of these shanties merged together, go back into the alpha, and with this selection made, let's click Ctrl+I to invert this. And so now if we just look at our alpha contains all of this painted detail that we have here. So let's now save this out, and when you're saving it out, make sure to save it out as either TIFF or EXR format, just so you retain this alpha. So in addition to this, let's do the exact same thing for the boats. Let's copy these and let's go into our alpha, select all and click delete to clear it, and let's just make a selection of the boats, or sorry, this is the people, not the boats. Let's select the people, and again, let's render this out separately as well. We will be able to make the people move in Nuke, but we want to complete that action separately in Nuke for the people and for the shanties that we have. We will want to add slight movement, but we want to do all of this work separately for all of these, and that's where we're also splitting these out from the base layers. So let's also select our boats, and let's do the same thing. Let's just create an alpha like this, and save this out as well as TIFF. And lastly, I will do the same for these top overpainted details that I have here. Okay, so let's zoom back out. Next, let's continue up to our waterfalls. And here I have mine split out into different layers based on distance. So I have my background, my midground, another midground, and 4 layers of foreground waterfalls. So the way I'm splitting these out is based on, and it'll be slightly more visible if I again create a black layer underneath here. My main aim is for each of these groups to not have overlapping waterfalls. So we will be able to in Nuke select this and animate it, select this, or this, or this, or this, or this. However, if, for example, we have these together in one image, then it'll be hard to separate all of these overlapping waterfalls. So I will be wanting to export my background waterfalls, and for these I don't even need to make an alpha. We can just keep this at white, because we will be able to do a luminance key on these in Nuke anyway. So if we go to save these out, I create a new folder called Photoshop Render Layers, and if I save everything as TIFF, this is where I make sure to save my render layers. And it helps if you tag them with whatever frame number they will be projected from. So for example, frame 50 or frame 1. This will just make it a little bit easier to not get confused later. So we export this out and then change it to this. And just keep splitting things out based on overlapping. So all of these overlapping elements we will be able to offset slightly in 3D to create more of an illusion of depth in between them. Continuing on, if we look at our depth, this is a relatively quick render in Clarice, and I will not be exporting this out of Photoshop. I will actually just select my render layer in Clarice and render 50 actual frames of the depth pass, because one thing that this will kind of help us out with is that any kind of irregularities in the projections from our base layers will be hidden by a lot of this fog. So we want the fog to be as sharp as possible, and because it renders quickly, it is not a big problem. So we will handle this in Clarice. For now, don't worry about it. Let's have a look at our rolling fog here, or that we have here, or rolling mist. And I think we can just export this out as a single layer. Again, there's no need to create an alpha because our fog is white already, and we will be able to just use a luminance keyer in Nuke to create an alpha out of that. So all of these are good except for this one. This one is reaching the bottom of the frame, and if you remember from earlier, this will be cutting at the bottom at frame 1. So we'll just export this as it is now, and we'll fix this problem in Nuke. I think we will want to add a slight bit animation to this fog before we project it, just to have some kind of nice effect of it moving through the city. And then we will also take our haze layer, and again we'll smooth out the bottom a little bit. I think what we could do before we export is select a soft brush, and let's just taper this fog off at the bottom so we won't have to worry about any projection problems. And we will also project this because, as we saw in the test DMP that we did in Nuke, there's actually very little parallax between the fog here and the fog here. So we will just be able to project it on something simple, like maybe a card, and I think we'll be able to get away with it instead of making complex fog in 3D that will take a lot of time to set up and a lot of time to render. Okay, so continuing on, I think our volume we will just actually render in Clarice. We will render it at a lower resolution because we'll have it as a very subtle effect, so we don't have to worry about it being as high of a resolution render as the others, because it takes longer to render usually, so that's how we'll get around that problem, just for the sake of speed. Instead, we'll go to birds, and this bird layer I think is worth rendering out separately. There are some very interesting ways that we can animate these birds using Nuke, and I believe truly the fastest way, because you can do it all in a single evening and get really good results that blend in nicely with the image, and having these birds move adds a lot of life and a lot of believability to our shot. So I think we'll do the same and select the birds and create an alpha. And we'll just export these out as well. And lastly, we will also do our edges. So the problem, if you remember earlier, that we had with edges was that we had to do this work above our depth, because otherwise the effect would have been lessened by the depth being on top and overriding the work we have done on the edges here. So instead, if we keep it at the top, what we can do is actually reuse these again in 3D by adding some simple projections around the edges of these buildings, and this projection will catch the painting that we have done around these edges, and this will increase the edge complexity and adds a slight bit more realism to the image and make it look less computer generated. And it's a simple workaround in order to then make these edges work in 3D with the fog in an honest way. So what we will do is we'll want to quickly take our edges layer, and with the depth disabled, let's duplicate it. And I just want to unify the colors of these edges, which of course previously I painted above all of my fog, so here they are quite white. If I just select all of these, you can see some of these stand out quite a lot, for example here. So I'll just want to quickly use the burn tool to darken these down and blend them in with their surroundings. And this doesn't have to be perfect because it's such a subtle thing. So this is mostly good here. I think here we can darken this quite a lot. And I'm just trying to make these edges blend in with the surrounding buildings. So let's just darken this as well. And this. And it doesn't have to be perfect, because we will basically use this projection of the edges as a clip mask on some geometry that we place around the edges of the buildings, and it will interact with the fog, so we'll be able to see the effect much more strongly through the fog. So we have this edges copy, and we're just going to rename this to edges graded. And another thing that I want to do actually is, if I go to my distant light and set this back to normal, I want to also create a version of this edges layer for my distant light. So let's copy this again, and here you can see that these little bits of overpainting stand out quite a lot. So what we will do first is we'll go to hue and saturation and just reduce the saturation to 0 because this render layer is black and white anyway. And let's again just start darkening these down just to roughly fit in with the surroundings. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. No one will be able to really notice this anyway. So let's just do this. It's a bit of a dirty method, but it's a nice trick. Okay, here a little bit. All of this. Bit of a manual process, but it takes a couple of minutes at most. Okay. So now what we will want to do is we'll want to, let's bring this back again for clarity. We'll want to take our edges that are graded and we'll create an alpha, and we'll want to save this out first, and we'll just again save them out as TIFF, and we call them DMP edges 01 frame 50. The different thing that we will want to do for these black and white edges is actually instead maybe, as a better idea, to just take this image as it is now with the distant light and with the edges, and instead let's just save this out as our new DMP distant frame 50. So we will just overwrite our previous file with a slight improvement. If you haven't done this or feel like you don't need to for your project, you can ignore this step. The last thing left is our layer with our airships. And let's just enable this all. And actually, I'm not going to export the textures for these airships just yet. I might want to adjust them slightly actually, because I will animate these airships and I will slightly change their position. So I will kind of, I think, redo them for 3D. Maybe if I had planned this out slightly better, I could have avoided this. However, when first creating the concept, I was just aiming for one image that captures all of the mood. However, in a moving sequence, we want to animate these to best lure us into the shot to make us feel like it's interesting. So the positioning will have changed slightly as the spaceships are flying. But apart from that, we have now exported all of the layers that we currently need from Photoshop. And next up, let's go have a look at how we can animate some of those in Nuke in order to get more interesting results than we would with just static images.